In this video, I'll be making a 7-inch camp knife out of 52-100 steel. Here I am applying layout dye to the bar stock so that I can trace the shape of the blade onto the stock with a carbide scribe. And once I've got everything marked out on the bar stock, it's time to cut out the rough profile of the blade using the metal cutting bandsaw, which is what I'm doing here in this shot. I leave everything a little bit oversized because this leaves a rough shape. So I need to take it to the belt grinder and clean everything up. And that's what I'm doing here, smoothing out the edge of the blades and rounding everything off. And so in this shot, you can see the knife is still kind of dirty and marked up, but it's a little smoother and looks more like a knife. In this shot, I'm cleaning up the flats on the 2x72 belt grinder, and here I am scribing out the holes that I'm going to drill in the knife to attach the handle scales. I'm prepping the knife for drilling, and in this shot I'm drilling the holes. I drill 3 holes to attach the scales, 1 hole for a lanyard, and multiple other holes just to lighten up the knife and improve the balance of the knife. So in this shot, I'm applying more layout dye to the knife so that I can scribe a center line along the edge, so I know when I'm grinding my bevels where they should meet in the middle. And I'm also, in this shot, scribing in my actual bevel lines, so I know how high up the knife I want to grind my bevels to. And here I am putting a plunge line jig on the knife so that when I'm grinding the bevels, the 2x72 belt grinder is stopped near the handles at the ricasso, leaving a nice clean plunge line on my bevels. And now it's on to the 2x72 belt grinder to start roughing in the bevels. This belt grinder removes material pretty quick, so I have to be careful and deliberate and precise. I think I've got a 40 grit belt on there initially just to start taking off material, and there you can see the bevels are starting to come in. This is the part of this whole process that requires the most technique and practice and manual dexterity and fine motor skills and things like that, is grinding in the bevels. It's pretty challenging to get the bevels even on both sides and to get straight lines and keep everything looking nice and not grind too far. I think I've switched up to a 60 grit belt here. You can see the bevels are pretty close to the lines that I had initially scribed in, so those bevels are about where I want them. So I'm now going to remove that plunge line jig because I've got a nice clean plunge line in there. In this shot, I have worked on the flats, and I've cleaned them up, removed all that layout dye. And so I think I'm going to switch up to now a 120 grit belt. At this stage, I'm not removing as much material, and I'm kind of more polishing the knife than I am really intentionally removing a lot of material. I alternate between working on the bevels and working on the flats as I work my way through the grits with this pre-heat trait bevel grind. And I think that's what the knife looked like at 120. So here I am switching to a 220 grit belt. I'm grinding away a little bit more, and this is what the knife looks like before it goes in the oven to be heat treated. Right now the steel is soft and workable, and this is the process. Heat treating is the process of hardening up the knife so it will hold an edge. Here I am programming the oven, 1650 Fahrenheit, for the first thermocycle. There's a process of what they call thermocycles, or essentially you kind of change the steel, you refine the grain of the steel, as they call it, before you harden it. Here I am creating a airtight pouch out of high temperature stainless steel foil to prevent a process called decarburization, where at these temperatures any oxygen that's in there will eat the carbon, and I want the carbon to stay in my knife. So I create this pouch, and once the carbon has been eaten by all the oxygen that's in there, and that oxygen is gone, the knife no longer has access to any more air to eat more carbon. Here it is. This is one of the thermocycles where I bring the blade up really, really hot, take it out, let it cool down to a certain temperature. I let it cool down until it is once again magnetic. I'm testing it with a magnet in this shot, and then I repeat the process. This is the oil that I'm going to quench my blade in. It needs to be at 130 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's there. And now the knife is ready for hardening. Take it out of the oven and directly into the oil as quick as possible to bring the temperature down. And at this point, the knife is really hard. I skipped a couple of steps of filming. I didn't film the tempering process, which is where I heat the knife up in such a way to bring down the hardness and bring back some toughness. And then I also skipped some of the grinding, the post-heat treat grinding. This is a still shot of the handle scale material before glue up. First shot was the raw materials, second shot was after everything had been cut, and the third shot was once the handle scales had been glued up. And here I am marking and scribing the knife and the handle scales to make sure everything lines up when it's time to drill holes in the handle scales. So I've got everything lined up, marked out, and now I clamp the scales to the bottom of the knife and take it back over to the drill press. I drill, when I'm drilling holes in the handle scales, I drill through the holes that are already in the knife, and I keep everything clamped so that I can be assured that all 3 holes in the scales will line up perfectly with the holes that are in the knife. In this shot, I'm cutting out the tube and the pin stock that I'll be using to, along with the glue, attach the knife handle scales to the knife itself. It's micarta tube and carbon fiber pin, and you can see the pins and the tubes are in the knife at this point, and everything lines up with the handle scales. So I'm marking on the scales where I need to cut them out. Again, I leave everything oversized because it's rough and it'll need to be further shaped on the belt grinder once everything's glued up. In this shot, I'm shaping and finishing actually part of the scales that I can't work on when they're on the knife. I have to do it before glue up. In this shot, I'm hand lapping the scales perfectly flat on a granite slab that has been machined flat. In that shot, I'm scoring the scales so that the epoxy has something to grab onto. In this shot, I'm scoring the actual knife with a really rough grit belt on the grinder. So again, the epoxy has something to grab onto. And here I am prepping for glue up, getting ready to glue getting ready to glue the handle scales to the knife, cleaning everything with acetone, removing the dirt and oil from my hands so the epoxy will be most effective. And I'm mixing up this 2-part epoxy. It takes about a day to cure, and it's made for fixing boats, actually. But it's a marine grade epoxy, but it works really well for attaching knife handle scales. And so here I am coating this. I coat the scales, I coat the knife, I coat the pins and the tube. You want a light coat on everything. So now I'm just kind of getting everything, getting the epoxy applied to all the various parts and getting everything pushed together. The scales and the knife and the pins and the tubes, they all fit together nicely, which I know because I did a test run before just to make sure. Now it's time to clamp everything together and wait a day for the epoxy to cure. And so that's, I think, where I'm at now. Is coming up here. This is a day later. Everything's cured, so I'm taking off the clamps and we'll see how it came out. Looks like everything came out well. The pins are all still where they should be, and the blade doesn't have too much epoxy on it. So I can trim off the excess pin and tube material on the bandsaw, take it to the belt grinder to clean up the flats on the handle scales. And then from there, I clean up the flats, and then from there I clean up the rough shape of the handles, kind of grind the excess material down so it's flush with the actual blade. And that's what I'm doing here as well, using the flat platen attachment for the grinder. And that's what the knife looks like at this point. It's coming together, getting pretty close to being an actual knife. I'm using the 2-inch wheel on my belt grinder to put in a Coke bottle kind of shape, just to give it better grip. I skipped a lot of grinding, but here I am getting ready to buff the handle scales with a buffing wheel and buffing compound. This just is kind of the final step on preparing the scales. It brings out the luster and kind of makes the scales look nice and shiny. And the final step in the process is grinding in the secondary bevel, the cutting edge. You can see here I've got a wet setup where water is continuously dripped on the knife. That's because heat builds up very quickly, and it's easy to get to 500-600 degrees and ruin the temper on the knife right at the edge, which we don't want. So this is the final product. I think all things considered, the knife came out pretty well. It's not perfect, but no knife ever is. There's about 5 or 10 things wrong with it, places where I screwed up making it, but yeah, on the whole, I like it. I think it's comfortable in the hand. The shape came out like I hoped. The blade finish is pretty darn good. I think I nailed the heat treat, so it should cut well. And I really like the handle scales in particular with that black canvas micarta, the houndstooth patterned burlap micarta, and then the natural canvas micarta on top with the orange G10 spacers. So this is the knife, a 7-inch camp knife out of 52-100 steel and with micarta handles. Thanks for watching.